After X1's disbandment in 2019, several post-X1 groups debuted, with the exception of Victon that had already been active since 2016. After X1 disbanded due to the produce scandal, Gravity, We, Drippin', Mirai, Unite, and BAE173 all made their debut under their respective companies. It was supposed to be a brand new start for the X1 members, a chance to continue with their idol career even after the premature disbandment they had to go through. But things haven't necessarily been looking so great for these new groups, and in this video we'll try to analyze what went wrong and what the companies could have done to avoid this situation. I won't really be talking about Victon because they had already been active before Produce, and I'll only focus on these newer groups that have debuted in the last few years. But first, let's briefly talk about X1. X1 was an 11-member group formed by CJENM through Mnet's survival show Produce X101, which was the fourth season of the Produce franchise. The group was co-managed by Stone Music Entertainment and they had their debut on August 27, 2019. They were originally planned to have a 5-year contract, but unfortunately, a voting manipulation investigation led to the discovery of a state of corruption of the Produce franchise, resulting in a halt in X1's activities. After that, the members' agencies started negotiations regarding the group's future. The agencies agreed that the group could only continue if there was an unanimous agreement, or else the group would disband. 4 agencies voted to continue, 4 agencies voted to disband, and 1 agency's vote was discarded because it was considered unclear, so it was eventually determined the group would disband. It is likely some of the companies decided to pull the members out of the group, probably thinking it would have been best for their image to distance themselves from X1 and the scandal. Ultimately, X1 disbanded in January 6, 2020 after only 5 months of activity. Before talking about post-X1 groups, we have to consider 4th Gen's landscape and the moment in time those groups debuted. As we all probably figured by now, 4th Gen is not a favorable landscape for new boy groups to make their debut. We need to consider the fact that none of these trainees companies were necessarily big, with the exception of Starship Entertainment, which is still only a medium-sized company after all. However, we have seen that even boy groups coming from bigger agencies are still behind girl groups in terms of general public's interest. So in conclusion, no matter which agency debuts a boy group in 4th Gen, none of these groups seem to garner as much traction as girl groups. So in conclusion, I believe that even if the X1 members' companies played all of their cards right, post-X1 groups would have still struggled to make a name for themselves during a time when people only seem to care about girl groups and boy groups from bigger agencies. But there is also another factor we have to consider, and it's the fact that X1 didn't even have enough time to build a core fanbase. Most of their fans were probably people who were pretty into them just because they were the next shiny thing. We all know how popular the Produce franchise was, and you best believe that everybody tuned in to watch it, both in Korea and internationally. And obviously it's likely people were very caught up in the show and naturally started following X1 because they were the new trendy boy group out there. But 5 months is not enough to build a solid fan base, so I really think that a lot of their fans actually dropped them the moment they disbanded. Only the real stands stuck around and followed the members into their new groups. I'm sure that if the group had stayed together for at least a year, then they would have really been able to build a core fandom for themselves. But in their 5 months of activity, I don't believe they managed to surround themselves with that many loyal stans willing to wait for them to re-debut in the midst of a scandal. So this was pretty much the situation at the time of X1's disbandment. So now let's talk about the post-X1 groups. Like I said earlier, even if the companies played their cards right, post-X1 groups still wouldn't have been able to get that popular after all. But there are still some things that these companies could have done better in order for these groups to make it bigger. First thing first, you have to know your target. If you debut a post-Produce group and you're under a small company, you know your target is gonna heavily consist of people who are fans of the Produce groups and are willing to follow the members in their new careers. Many people don't have the time and energy to get into many groups, let alone if there are many members in them. And unfortunately there are 6 post-X1 groups out there, with a total of 46 members, 38 of which are new members to get to know. This might put off some people. People might not want to have to keep up with 6 new groups and so many new members. So if there's something companies should do is try to make their groups a bit smaller. If you are somehow familiar with post-X1 groups, you'll see there are some members who are really underutilized in these groups, especially in groups like Unite and BAE173. By debuting them with less members, everyone would have been able to shine more, and the already famous members wouldn't have ended up overshadowing the others. A second aspect to take into account is their concept and sound. Most of these groups' music videos and songs look like they could belong to the same group. They don't really have a strong identity and image that can distinguish them from other fourth-gen groups. Some of these groups have also had severe concept changes so early in their careers. For example, Unite debuted with a super bright concept, and from their first comeback they had already changed completely. BAE 173 also debuted with a very bubbly and cute song. Then their first comeback was kinda giving second-gen vibes, and it was honestly an improvement in terms of music quality. But then their following comeback took a completely different turn and they started making the same exact music and concept that every other boy group is doing right now. Groups like Mirai, Drippin' and We didn't necessarily undergo drastic concept changes, but they definitely feel pretty generic in such an oversaturated market. The group that I'll say is going in the right direction is Gravity. Their debut felt pretty underwhelming and their following comebacks were really generic and didn't really do the group justice, at least in my opinion. But then they started coming out with songs like Adrenaline, Party Rock and their most recent comeback Groovy, which were a big upgrade in music quality and felt much more interesting in terms of concept. I personally think they're really thriving with this type of vibe they have going on because it fits them extremely well. It seems like Starship has finally figured out what style suits them best, and I believe they're only gonna keep growing as time goes by. But unfortunately we can't say the same things for the other post-X1 groups. To be honest, I don't see things changing that much for any of these groups, with the exception of Gravity. Now I know what you are gonna say, that obviously Gravity has it easier because they are from a bigger company. But this is clearly not the only reason. There are quite a few boy groups that come from companies that are smaller than Starship and they made it big. For example, 80s, The Boys, Astro, and obviously BTS as well. So it's not just about the company you're from. It's also about other factors such as concept, sound, social media presence, and of course timing, which I believe was possibly the biggest disadvantage for these post-X1 groups that debuted in a generation that seems to mostly overlook boy groups as a whole. With that being said, we reached the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have more experience with post-X1 groups, then feel free to let me know in the comments if there's anything I missed. Bye guys.